Okay, this week I have the great fortune of getting a chance to talk to somebody who very secretly was one of my mentors when I was getting started in a lot of this stuff. His name's Chris Dobrian, and those of us in the Max world will recognize his name from the original MSP tutorials, which the original Max. Which was it? I don't even remember now.
Well, I actually have been doing the Max documentation from the beginning of its commercial release. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were there for an awful lot of stuff that was really important to sort of like my coming up to speed. And so that's how a lot of people recognize his name, but a lot of people that are in the academic music scene will recognize his name from a lot of different threads throughout the years. So I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to and get caught up with Chris Dobrian. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Very well, thanks.
Thanks a lot for taking a little time to have a chat. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
You and I keep on bumping into each other at like trade shows and conferences and stuff, so it's nice to actually get a chance to finally sit down and talk. So why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about what it is that you're currently doing?
I'm on the faculty at the University of California, Irvine, south of Los Angeles. And we started, I guess it's actually been about 8 or 9 years ago already, we started a Master of Fine Arts program in what we call Integrated Composition, Improvisation, and Technology, which is an unwieldy title, so we just call it ICIT. It's really an attempt to sort of break down all of the boundaries that traditionally delineate graduate programs in music. You know, you usually have your composition area and your classical performance and your jazz performance and your computer music and on and on. And we said, you know, these not only are these divisions of no interest to us personally on the faculty, but they're not even very realistic in terms of what's actually going on in the music world. So we decided to as a way not only to sort of satisfy ourselves, but also to sort of make a unique niche in the academic scene, to create a graduate program that kind of focused on the integration of all of these things rather than the separation of those things. Just recently, it's become a PhD program now. So we have a PhD in ICIT at UC Irvine.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, it's interesting to now see PhD programs coming onto their own. I mean, for a long time, this kind of work was kind of put in, you know, the composition side of music departments, and so people would get their DMA or whatever and kind of go that direction. But I've noticed more and more this sort of music meets art meets technology thing is starting to show up in PhD programs, and that's pretty exciting, actually.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the early days of electronic music, and by early days, I guess I mean really the 1950s. Of course, obviously there was electronic music going on long before that. But you know, when people like Stockhausen and Berio and folks were, you know, sort of becoming known not only as classical instrumental composers but also electronic music composers, pretty much everybody who was doing electronic music was coming from that angle of being a classical composer already. Whereas now, today in computer music, people are coming from all sorts of angles, maybe from sound art or from you know, from something that maybe doesn't even have anything to do particularly with music originally, such as artificial intelligence or computer algorithms, or all kinds of different angles. So the whole field of computer music, I think, has changed pretty radically. But it's interesting to me to always remember that, you know, for a long time it was dominated by composerly thinking in the sort of classical sense.
Well, yeah, especially since what you would often see, the integration of the technology would sort of be like a composer kind of embracing the technology, but kind of having like an engineer dude tagging along to like keep the bits running, right?
Absolutely. And they would be the rogue crazies in whatever music department they were in, you know, who would sort of sneak a little bit of this oddball stuff in. And in fact, I think in most music departments, it may still be the case, but probably less so than it was a while back, that composers were the vast minority. They were just, they again, were the rogue oddball crazies within a music department.
Right.
The people who are actually doing contemporary music and you know, producing these weird sounds, and then they would sort of sneak in their little, you know, whatever it happened to be at the time, tape recorders and Moog synthesizers and things into their departments. So it's always been this sort of thing where it's been the outsider thing. And then I think with computer music, it really came to be the fact, first of all, that computers were only found at academic institutions, and then and really that you needed all of these different types of knowledge. You needed the mathematical knowledge and the computer programming knowledge and all these things to even get started in the field at all.
Right. What do you think is making it to where the sort of like academic popularity or academic recognition is starting to show up. Because you're right. I mean, until even recently, it was sort of like, you're right. The composition guys were the nut jobs in the department, and then the ones that would be working on, you know, particularly like tech heavy or theoretic heavy computer music were even like the weirdos of that world.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, the subculture of the subculture
Yeah,
of the subculture.
exactly. What do you think is causing that to kind of go a little more in main line?
I mean, the obvious explanation is just the sheer ubiquity of computers in our lives now, that they're just everywhere and they do everything, and that there is so much software that kind of shields you from having to be a real geek to get into it. You can, you know, get into at a very advanced level. I mean, you look at a program like Ableton Live, which is stunningly complicated and capable, and yet all kinds of people can get into it without really knowing anything about how to program or, you know, or a lot of different things, or even necessarily having any background in music composition.
Given that we talk about it even recently being the weird end of the weird crew, how did you get started? I mean, what put you in a position to where you were already comfortable enough to be introducing people through the documentation of Max and MSP, and you were part of the academic world, but also part of the practical world in computer music, long before any of us even thought of it as a thing?
I guess I would say I was very fortunate when I went to college. So I grew up in the Midwest, in Iowa City, Iowa, and
Yay, Midwest!
yeah, let's hear it for the Midwest. And although having heard you describe your life in rural Wisconsin, it sounds like maybe Iowa City was a little bit different. It was, you know, it's a college town, and it was sort of the liberal bastion within the state of Iowa. But I had a professor father and a professor grandfather, and so, you know, was in this sort of teacherly way of thinking, although I didn't have any particular idea I would become a professor as I grew up. But the other thing I suppose that's noteworthy from my youth was that I played guitar from a pretty early age, but not an electric or a steel string guitar, but a nylon string guitar, which was kind of a weird thing to do in the Midwest in the 1960s and 70s. And so as a result, when I wanted to go to college, I knew I wanted to study music, but there was no place one could study guitar except on the coasts.
Right.
So I got in my 69 Dodge Tradesman van and drove out to UC Santa Cruz. UC Santa Cruz, of course, was a very, I guess still is sort of a hippie place, but it was a very hippie place in the 1970s. And I had the good fortune to meet, I guess, three professors who were particularly influential, who had just arrived either shortly before I came there or while I was there. One was David Cope, who's, of course, very well known for his experiments in musical intelligence and his many books about contemporary music and computer music. But in fact, since I met him, I guess in 1978, that was before he was doing really any work with computers particularly. So he was my teacher of theory and composition, but he was, you know, very much a liberalizing and perverting influence in my life. And I also took a course in the history of electronic music with Gordon Moma, who was on the faculty there and had arrived just shortly before I did. And that, of course, was very influential also in opening my mind to all of these possibilities. And then the third person who I definitely should mention is when, I guess it would have been about 1980, Peter Elsey joined the faculty at UC Santa Cruz. And he actually was the one who got down and did the dirty work of setting up an electronic music studio, which, if I remember right, consisted of 2 Revox stereo tape recorders, reel-to-reel recorders, and a Moog synthesizer, Moog modular system. And so I learned the art of tape splicing and the basics of analog synthesis from him. He was a very patient and kindly teacher.
It's funny having interacted with Peter over the years. It's interesting to even imagine him just getting started.
Yeah, just a young guy, like just, you know, getting his first academic gig and setting up a studio.
Setting up the first 2 Revoxes. That's crazy. Yeah. Wow.
So then I sort of dropped out for a year or so and just hung out and traveled and stuff. And then I went to graduate school at UC San Diego, where Richard Moore had just set up a computer music facility there in what was, I guess at the time, called the Center for Music Experiment, and then became the Center for Research in Computing at the Arts at UC San Diego. And so from him, I learned the basics of C programming and the mathematics of digital signal processing, the basics of how computers digitize sound, all of that good stuff. You know, and we did our little programs in a C sound-like language that he had written called C music, and also just programming from scratch in C. on a VAX 11, what was it, 11780 computer?
11780, yeah, that was my first music computer too.
Yeah, yeah, we shudder now as we think about it, but it was the kind of thing where you'd write a program and you'd go out and smoke a cigarette waiting for your 10 seconds of uninteresting sound to compute.
That's right.
And then find out you'd left out a comma somewhere and the whole thing hadn't worked.
Well, and the fact that realistically, I mean, you bring up a point, which computer music was far from being a real-time thing. I mean,
yes,
it's so...
In fact, I should even mention that if you wanted to do anything that involved spectral processing, FFTs and the like, you were talking an overnight compile.
Right, right.
You know, so you'd set your job in motion and then you go home and sleep and come back the next day to hear your results.
It blows me away the things that we put up with back in the day. You know, I remember the thing that actually hooked me in the realm of computer music was this thing that, you know, some unnamed grad student did where, you know, he worked for an entire semester to make like this 4-minute computer music piece. And then he did his senior concert, which is like him on stage with the tape deck, but then he played a bassoon along with it. And so the combination of the two was really compelling. It was a beautiful sound thing, but this idea of doing a concert by like working for a half of a year to come up with 4 minutes of music, and so then the only way to perform it was to stand on, you know, up at the stage and like click that big lever to engage the reel-to-reel deck to play it's so different than it is now. It's amazing. My
recollection is, and I'm no historian, so my recollection could be faulty, but I think the commercial release of Max was about 1990 or 91 maybe. I think probably early 91 is my guess. The first ICMC conference that I went to was 92 in San Jose. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, Max was kind of on everybody's lips at the time. And David Ziccarelli gave his, what was it, music technology as parasite talk, which was very interesting.
His history of like crazy ass.
I love the fact that he does these very challenging, you know, you guys are all full of shit kind of keynote speeches at these conferences, which is great. But always in his soft-spoken, very diplomatic, gentle way, right?
When I was at SEAMUS, I was like sitting listening to some of the concert pieces, and I was like, oh, you know, I looked up his old piece about the wire whisks, right? About
that was like
everything sounding like a wire
in 2001 or something,
right.
I think.
Right. I think he actually sent Richard Dudas to read that one because it was that was in the middle of some bad travel times. But
okay.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, given the difficulties, why did you persevere? What was it about computer music that was such a draw to you?
You know, I think what was maybe somewhat different for me was that I was never particularly interested in the pursuit of strange and interesting sounds. I was very much coming from a kind of classical composerly background, and so my interest in computers was really in the fact that they could, theoretically at least, perform anything you could write for them. And so it was kind of like as a super performer, as it were. Of course, then I quickly realized that meant that you were foregoing all of the wonderful things that live performers actually bring to a situation, and you had to specify every single nuance of every single note. But that was, I think, the original fascination, and that's what got me into being fascinated with algorithmic composition. And I think also it was like this sort of idea that, you know, in theory you could learn how to compose, which, you know, that's kind of a funny idea that you just took the right classes and you learned the right stuff and then you'd be a composer. And so I've always, I think for my whole life, sort of been in pursuit of knowing how to compose and always failing. But it seemed like the process of trying to teach that to a computer was a good way to test out theories of how to compose.
Sure.
In other words, if you could teach anything, however simplistic, to a computer, that meant you presumably understood it in some way. And it was sort of a way of approaching theories of composition that was rather unique for me.
It's interesting you say that, because I actually, right before we had this interview, I was out for a morning meeting with a local academic guy who has some desire to learn some more coding things. And that was actually one of the things we talked about, was this idea that the process of learning to apply technology to this was one of really breaking things down to a very atomic level, so that you could explain it or implement it in some way in the computer, and that you actually kind of go through a learning or a relearning of things yourself. It's a real powerful mechanism.
Yeah, And I think so I think I got my first Macintosh in maybe '86 or so, the Mac Plus. But it was a a real eye opener. But the fact was that you had to still know how to program menus and windows and things like that. So when somebody sort of leaked this illicit copy of this patcher language that was coming out of Earcam to me, it's like, oh, it kind of does all that stuff for you, and now I can just focus on doing my little compositional algorithms.
Right.
So this program was leaked to me by a friend who was working at Earcam. I think it was leaked to a lot of people and by a lot of friends, and as a way of teaching it to myself, because there was really no documentation or anything, I would just sort of plow through it and try and figure things out in the patcher language, and then I would take little notes to myself, which became this set of like 10 tutorials or whatever. When Joel Chatterby, I guess, got the license from Earcam to release it as a commercial product, when he had his company Intelligent Music.
Intelligent, right.
And then before doing so, he, I think, sold the license or passed it on to Opcode Systems.
Right.
So that was when David Ziccarelli came on board as the main programmer, and they hired me to do the documentation simply because I had written this silly little set of 10 explanations. And they said, well, you're one of the few people who knows how this thing even works and can write. And so I have this memory of spending a period of maybe 2 or 3 months just writing every day for 8 hours and being on the phone with David and looking at patcher source code and figuring out how the follow object worked or whatever,
Right.
and then writing about it.
I talked to a lot of people who've heard of or maybe even interacted with the patcher language, but very few people who sort of saw that transition from what Earcam was calling the patcher language and what became the first versions of Macs. And what changes, what occurred during that transition to make it even useful as a commercial product? Because, I mean, patcher itself was just kind of created in order to help implement some things for some composers to do their work.
Yeah, exactly.
So taking something with that conceptual basis and turning it into a commercial product, there must have been a tremendous number of changes. What are the big things that you kind of recall in that shift?
Well, I mean, my impression of Miller Puckett, the originator of Patcher, is that he's a freaking genius, but he's not particularly a detail-oriented, let's take this thing to the commercial market kind of guy. He's a mathematician and, like I say, a kind of conceptual, creative thinker and a genius guy. But the fact that it actually got in the hands of people who wanted to make it into a commercial product, namely Chris Halevy of Opcode Systems and David Ziccarelli, who I guess at that time probably had already had some experience writing DX7 patcher editor librarians.
Right.
And I think he'd done the Jam Factory and M programs with Joel Chatterby and Intelligent Music. So he had a lot of experience of just how to make something look a little nicer, behave a little nicer, things like number boxes that you could not only type into but drag on, all these sorts of little niceties of making it into a product. And I think, not to take any credit for the popularity of Macs, other than to say that the fact that there was actually an explanation of how to use the darn thing. So that the fact that there was a manual now finally for this program, I mean, I think it surprised everybody how much it caught on. Certainly it surprised Chris Halevy of Opcode. He just he took it on faith from Joel Chatterby telling him, you really should make this into a commercial product. And they didn't, I think, expect to sell many copies at all.
Right.
And suddenly all of these people like myself who'd been lurking around waiting for a good programming language in which to do their work, suddenly it was there and it had a manual. And it was so that by the time of this ICMC in 1992, there were already people like Mari Kimura and Todd Winkler who were doing pieces with it. And that was the first time that I sort of heard this term of interactive computer music. Of course, people had been doing interactive things. I mean, Joel Chatterby had his theremin-controlled Moog system, and there's a lot of interactive stuff. But that was when that word was kind of getting to be big. And Todd Winkler wrote this book, Composing Interactive Music, right? Which I think, like books take a long time to get going, so I don't think it actually came out till several years later. But he was definitely thinking about that stuff, and so there were a few people, starting to talk about this stuff. But interestingly enough, it was also the time when George Lewis, who was actually a professor of mine at San Diego, when I went back and finished my doctorate, he had just joined the faculty at UC San Diego, and he, of course, had been doing his own brand of interactive computer music back in the 80s using fourth computer language and working at IRCAM. He was kind of, you know, not in the mainstream of IRCAM activity, but he was the rogue crazy of IRCAM, I guess, doing his interactive computer music before its time. And so he was kind of there at the 1992 ICMC saying, you guys are all talking about interactivity, but you're talking about it in this very kind of uninformed way, and you're talking about computers improvising, but have you actually really studied the history of improvised music? And so he was kind of the rabble rouser in that sense of sort of calling into critical question some of these things that were being bandied about, like the word interactivity and computer improvisation and all that stuff.
Well, but you kind of need that. You kind of need that rogue person, otherwise.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
see it in arts all the time, where, you know, interactivity comes, and then for a long time it goes into this kind of semi-stasis where interactivity means I clap my hands and somebody, you know, and something happens.
Sure.
And or I wave my arms and something waves back. And you know, you go through these,
which you know, when you boil it down, that's not much more sophisticated than turning on a light.
Right.
You know,
that is what a light switch does.
It's a one-to-one relationship, and so that was one thing that George sort of, you know, pointed out to me, is if you want to start talking about interactivity, then you need to think in a more sophisticated way about what interaction really is in a musical context. And the other thing I think that George gave me a helpful nudge toward was saying, well, you're interested in algorithmic composition, but now computers you don't have to wait overnight to hear the results. They do it instantaneously. So now you can really start thinking about algorithmic improvisation and what that means, what it means to be composing instantaneously in a real-time situation with live performers. And that requires then that the computer be aware of its musical context, who's doing what around it, and so on. In other words, the computer has to be a good listener as well as an interesting composer.
Right. To a large extent, Max, when it first came out, it was the only kind of reasonable way to do any sort of programming, because otherwise, like you said, you had, you know, 2 weeks worth of menu processing. You finally got to the point where you could actually, you know, maybe write some DSP code or something.
Right.
But Max was really focused on MIDI at the time, MIDI and event handling.
It didn't do audio at all, except in the more sort of institutional versions like at IRCAM, where they had Max FTM. Crazy
side route on that. But for you, what did your work look like at the time? So you said you were never really interested in the super crazy sound design part of it or sound capabilities. So what given that you kind of, I mean, it was the world of MIDI, right? So you kind of had to deal with these devices that were sort of like oriented for, you know, George Duke type sounds or whatever. And you had to find a way to implement presumably a more sophisticated kind of sound as well as composition. How did you make the two work?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So definitely studying with Richard Moore at UC San Diego, I did learn a lot of the details of the fundamentals of sound synthesis and how you make sounds with the computer. But as I said, you know, just the pursuit of novel sounds was never so much of interest to me in and of itself. I was more interested in musical structure per se, I guess. The fact was that, and I think it was probably around that time, maybe late 80s, that the Yamaha disc clavier came out. And because I was in this Center for Music Experiment at San Diego, they lent one to the center for people to experiment with. And so some of my first computer music pieces were actually for Yamaha disc clavier, and that was a good way of getting around the difficulty of composing or of synthesizing interesting sounds. Was just send MIDI to a piano, which already has a fairly agreeable and complex sound, and then you can hear the results of your musical structures. So some of my early pieces, I guess now, almost anything you do with a disc clavier sounds somewhat Nancaro-ish. Right. Because you're making a computer, or you're making a piano do something sort of superhuman. Right. But some of my early experiments with the disc clavier had to do with, you know, music that's going on in 10 different tempos at once, or music maybe that implements some idea of entropy and neg entropy, and kind of how music can go from being very predictable to very unpredictable, and that interesting space in between where you're not in this key and you're not in that key, you're in some blend of the two keys, and these sorts of things, they're purely numerical in terms of their compositional conception, and yet they can, if you put a little of your own composerly input into them, they can provide some rather interesting results.
Now, one of the things I always am curious about with people who sort of embraced the bleeding edge of doing stuff with MIDI at the time was, as I recall, sort of like that period during the 80s, things were changing fast. Things with electronic music and electronic music instruments and the technology was rapidly, in the 90s, the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. It was like rapidly changing. I mean, literally, like you would have to be subscribed to all these magazines like Electronic Musician and Keyboard and stuff like that, because even in the 2 weeks between one issue of one magazine and the issue of the next, like 4 things would change, and you're like reading through the books to try and figure out.
Yeah, that's kind of my recollection too. There was some new novel, revolutionary type of synthesis that came out every other year.
And like the CMJ was quarterly, and you're like, damn, each issue is like things that didn't exist in the previous issue, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that anybody, when MIDI first came out, was like, this is the be all and end all. We'll be doing MIDI for the next 30 years, right?
Yeah. Right.
Which is what ended up happening, but I don't think anybody foresaw that in any way, shape, or form, right? Was there ever any concern that you were doing compositions for a potentially self-obsoleting system? That it would be like people who did, I always think of like people who wrote compositions for the Ondas Martineau, right? Mm-hmm. All of a sudden that instrument doesn't exist anymore, and you're like, what do I do with this thing, right?
Yeah. Well, don't you think that all of us who are working in computer music, we're all essentially writing pieces that, will probably only exist in some sort of documentary form, like a recording or a video. Oh. Almost all of these pieces are not general enough that technology is likely to be around 20 or 30 years from now.
Well, would you be able to like resurrect those Disklavier pieces and play them, or is it like on too old of an operating system where it's like stuck on a diskette that you'll never be able to read again?
No, I mean, because they're simply Max patches. So Max is, as a program, and David, overseeing that process, it has stayed pretty backward compatible as such things go over its many versions, so that a Max 2.0 patch will still run, and MIDI hasn't changed drastically, and Disklaviers have only gotten better. So that kind of thing, in that way, I've been using some of the more stable of the computer music technologies, I guess, right, in that sense. But I actually don't have many delusions that I'm writing music for the ages. I'm just trying to do things that are interesting to me and trying to, in some way, contribute to the community of music that's going on currently.
And to what extent, so you actually mentioned, though, that too, I mean, Max, and it grows the tendrils of MSP engine and all these things, so it gets more complex, but it also is running on much faster computing platforms. The Disklavier has gone through many, many updates. I mean, is there a sense to which actually things can get like too good for the implementation of pieces? I mean, I don't think your stuff was as oriented towards like the crusty breakdown edge that some composers sort of lived in, but even in that case, do you ever find that sometimes, oh crap, the thing I did before, it kind of worked because stuff couldn't keep up, or stuff wasn't quite up to snuff for what I was trying to accomplish?
I get what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think, like, for example, just to take the Disklavier as an example, because it's an instrument that I've stuck with quite a bit. I've had interesting pianist friends for whom I've done pieces, and so it's been a good instrument for me to work with. And but very early on, I recognized that it did have its limitations. You've actually got to physically get that hammer to the string,
right?
So it's not instantaneous the way an electronic synthesizer is, and it does have it's how fast can you do a repeated note if you have to do that problem of getting the hammer to the string and then back to its resting location and back to the string. So I did a lot of testing when I first started working with the Disklavier, like to sort of find its limitations, and probably its limitations have receded over the years as well. So I was never sort of taking advantage of, in a sort of glitch music sense of pushing it beyond its boundaries or anything like that. I was trying to work with it as an actual instrument.
Sure.
But it's an interesting thing to question, is whether, you said something about music, is the technology getting too good? And I'm not actually sure what that might mean, other than that maybe things that depended on some insufficiencies of the system now work too well or something.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. And your music doesn't tend to try and take advantage of that. But I was just wondering if you had ever noticed, like, a composition all of a sudden sounds different. You realize, oh, that last update I did just all of a sudden handled a problem that I didn't realize it, but was inadvertently banking on.
Oh yeah. One thing that's funny is when I as you know, I make a lot of music Max examples for my classes that I teach, and on the Max forums and so on. And sometimes I look at some of these examples and say, whoa, that was an example I did 15 years ago, and you wouldn't do it that way now, because you've got these other objects that do it for you. So in that sense, yeah, but no, I don't think I've had the experience of having pieces that just don't work properly anymore or anything like that.
So now that you're teaching, what are the things that people are looking to do now that you didn't expect, right? Because again, having kind of come up through the system, there were expectations. You could kind of like cast out in the future and say, I'll bet electronic music is going to look like this in the future. Or I bet nobody's going to care about electronic music in the future, right?
Well, what was the thing? I think it was Bob Ostertag who had this remark that if 1970s us could look at us today, they would be really disappointed at how little we've done with the technology.
Well, that's true, but on the other hand, 1970s us would have never expected we'd be working on our composition in a airport waiting to get on a flight.
Yes, of course, yeah.
It's there's a lot, but what do you see? What do you see that you didn't expect, or what do you see that maybe was too easy to imagine, or what might you see that kind of disappoints you? Because now, as an educator, you get to kind of interact with new people coming through the system and new people with their visions of what the future. Where does that sit for you? How do you feel about what you're seeing there?
Yeah, I think one thing that's worth saying is that I'm not particularly interested in technology per se, or even computers per se. Which, given that I'm such a geek, it may seem strange, but and it's not like I'm saying, oh, it's just a tool, it doesn't really have any particular significance. Obviously, it does have a profound significance in the way that we think about music, but I'm more interested in the ways that we think about music than I am in the toys themselves. And so I'm interested in my teaching, I think, first of all, to give students a solid background in the fundamentals that will help them to deal with whatever new toys do come along, because the toys are going to change drastically, and even Max will be gone someday, but lots of other programs will be gone rather quickly, and so the students don't need to learn how to use programs, they need to learn concepts that will help them in making music. And then the other aspect is to help them to think about music in a sophisticated way that will allow them to make progress in their own musical and artistic work. So I'm not sure if I'm really answering your questions. I wouldn't say anything has disappointed me particularly, but I do notice, like, if I go to an ICMC conference now, I kind of feel like the old fart who's just sitting there looking at everybody's presentations and going, yeah, we did that stuff in the 80s,
Right.
And so I realize that maybe in some ways I'm getting to be the old guy who should just sort of recede from the scene and let these young folks do their thing. And there are some aesthetic aspects of that too. You know, I'm not particularly enamored of, you know, what's now called electronica, which is just the same Ableton loop repeating endlessly, and then maybe you change one clip in your loop and go on and do that for another 5 minutes. That's not a particular type of aesthetic that appeals to me, but I recognize that's just old fart Chris talking, and you know.
Well, but that does though. I mean, the one thing that I would say, I agree with that. Although the one thing I would say that interests me about that, not that I want to listen to it, but I find it interesting that people have the willingness to have that be music. I mean, there was, you know, there was a time where you didn't, I guess, like REO Speedwagon changed every verse in some way that was peculiar or something, right? And
sure, I mean, even if you just think about, you know, a human drummer with all of his or her imperfections, every single drum stroke is subtly different. It's hitting the drum in a slightly different place, and every single 4 bars is played with a different fill or a different whatever. So that's an entirely different aesthetic from a drum machine. And so of course, the one grew out of the other, but they really have nothing to do with each other in terms of musical aesthetic. And, you know, I think that's fine to just sort of recognize the differences and say, okay, that's an interesting thing to observe. It's not really to say that one is fundamentally better or worse than the other.
But it is interesting to me that, and, you know, I mean, the other thing that I think has been a phenomenal difference, I think, you know, both hip hop and electronic music open the door for things like repetition as sort of as a part of popular culture. But the other thing is, I think, like film music really opened people's ears up to sound design in a way that I would have never expected.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
I wouldn't, the things that you hear in EDM tracks now, or even the things that you hear as background noise in commercials, I would have never guessed that the stock consumer ears would be willing to take that on, you know?
Sure. Well, clearly the ability to cut and paste that was provided by the Macintosh computer, you know, just profoundly influenced aesthetics in general, and influenced so many aspects of our life. But then also, what was the other aspect you were talking about just now? The acceptance of such a variety of sound in our world, where in the early days of even pre-electronic music, you think about the introduction of percussion as a prominent aspect of classical music, or you think about John Cage introducing found sounds, and then you think of music. There are all these things which were so revolutionary at their time, and now for everybody that's just such old hat that it's just, yeah, sure, of course every sound can be used as part of a musical texture. Why would you question that? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. So what now, one of the things that came up recently that had your name on it, kind of talking about your role as an academic, one of the things that came across with your name on it was an article that you wrote for the SEAMUS that I went to up in St. Cloud that was talking specifically about kind of diversity in both the art and the classroom as it relates to electronic music, right? It's presented by Molly Jones, but you were one of, I think she actually interacted with you.
Yeah, we sort of co-wrote the article. Yeah.
In the creation of the article, and it was related to research that you were doing, or sort of like some efforts you were doing in the school to.
That's right. We had hosted a symposium on women in music technology at UCI, and she had been one of the prime organizers of that conference.
Now, it's interesting that to me, after being sort of like I don't know, maybe a quiet concern for years, this is something that all of a sudden is like being talked about openly in conferences and in, you know, across the board. It's come up at like everything I've gone to in the last, say, 9 months. What do you think is causing that to be a point of recognition? And I'll say not only in academic conferences, but even in like music industry conferences, they're like, we have to do things to promote having more women in our involved in our particular arts, you know, and then when they would give the numbers, I mean, some of them were scary. Some of these software companies have, you know, a 98th percentile male population in their user groups, which really causes a monoculture that isn't necessarily super artistic, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But what do you think it is that's causing that to pop to the surface in such a significant way?
I couldn't necessarily answer that question, but maybe I can give some perspective on it, which is that I think for a long time, up until quite recently, actually, it was just sort of accepted that all of these disparities existed. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody had to like them. A lot of people, of course, were, you know, protesting against the fact that things were completely male-dominated or completely white-dominated or whatever. But that was just how things were. And so it was almost like to think otherwise was to be part of a revolutionary fringe group. And then there was sort of I suppose you could call it, if you wanted to get dramatic, the culture wars, you know, of the end of history and the end of racism and all this stuff, where people were sort of saying, it's not a big deal. You know, it's just, there were people who were saying that, you know, all this diversity stuff, it's just a fad. It's going to go away. You know, we just sort of have to weather the storm and everything can continue being as it is. And then I think we finally got to this place where people really did realize it's too late for that. things have changed. You know, there is a diversity of populations in the United States. Women are active in all kinds of things. You can't hold these old-fashioned views anymore and get away with it. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of people still either adamantly fighting for it or just sort of subconsciously upholding it. It's still a major problem, I think. Right. But I think we've kind of, in my mind anyway, we've passed that time when we can pretend that it's not an issue. And so maybe people are there's just sort of the zeitgeist that we have to deal with this issue in some way, whether we like it or not. You know, if we're part of the establishment that already is in the dominant position, we don't have to necessarily like it, but we have to at least deal with it, right? But in my case, I think I was always bothered by the homogeneity of the academic computer music world. Right. To the point where at a certain point, I almost felt like I was part of some Southeastern golf country club that, you know, was just all white guys sitting around and
complaining about those people. Right.
Right. Yes. And even if they didn't explicitly have rules banning those people, the culture existed that strongly discouraged those people. Right. And I didn't want to be part of that culture anymore. And so within our own department, I wanted to try and at least do our best to promote diversity, not just diversity for social justice sake, although that's a perfectly good reason to promote diversity. But, you know, the case that I make in that paper is that really for just the hybrid vigor of intellectual pursuit, you need various viewpoints and you need various experiences and people to come from different backgrounds. If it's a bunch of like-minded people sitting together in a room, they're just reinforcing and ossifying their own prejudices and not being exposed to new ideas. So diversity in a university is absolutely crucial. And it seems like you shouldn't have to argue that point anymore, but in fact, you do have to argue that point. And then once you've even accepted that point, it's not obvious how you make changes in the way that these structures exist. So when I started looking into actual statistics for this paper, I'd say, well, gee, yeah, if you look at the way that music faculty have changed over the past 50, 60 years, yes, for all professors in all universities, the numbers do look pretty equal. But then you start looking at particular subgroups, like let's look only at full professors now. Right. And now the numbers get really bizarrely skewed. Right. And then you look at full professors in music technology and the numbers get even more skewed. But I didn't want my paper to be just a listing of all of these statistical facts. That seems like, you know, first of all, that's really not my specialty to be that sort of a sociologist, but it's also the kind of thing I just didn't want to have to waste time doing. It's like, let's just acknowledge that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. I don't need to prove it to you with a bunch of statistics. So really what I wrote about in the paper was more sort of, you know, what can we actually do to change this somewhat? And one of the things I think that's really clear is that it's not a problem that just suddenly rears its head at graduate programs in music technology. It's a program that starts pretty much almost from birth, where girls are socialized to, and actually boys of color as well, are socialized not to think of themselves as engineers, not to think of themselves as mathematicians, not to think of themselves as technologists or scientists. And that just, you know, as I think Mary Simone said, like about 20 years ago, she wrote a paper for ICMC on this subject, and she said that, you know, even those who do make it through that vast system of filtering and make it to a college program in music technology, their brilliance has been attenuated by that system of filters that has sort of acted to keep them down over time.
Right. I mean,
it's a really complex and difficult to solve issue for sure.
Yeah. So what are, for yourself and in your practice, what are some of the things that you did that were particularly effective in basically making it clear to people that it was all right to give this a try, right? Because I think one of the things that certainly came up in the discussions after the paper was presented at SEAMUS was the descriptions of so many of some of the, if not entry gates, then at least the speed bumps that prevent people from feeling comfortable trying to enter a program, whether it's kind of like an extreme performance prerequisite on an instrument for someone whose instrument might be a DAW or a turntable, right? Mm-hmm. Or this sense that women often, even in music programs, are pushed into a performance role rather than a compositional or technological role. Mm-hmm. You know, what are things that you've done specifically to try and that you feel have been successful in trying to swing doors open that might otherwise either explicitly or implicitly be closed?
Yeah, you know, I honestly can't say that I'm any more successful than anyone else at it, which is interesting. I struggle as much as anyone to help this problem and be helpful to this issue. I would say we started this ICIT program with the idea that it would be more inclusive because it would break down some boundaries and it would focus on these sorts of integrations of technologies that young people were doing more today. Turns out, though, that we were kind of narrow-minded in our conception in the sense that we were focusing on composition, improvisation, and technology, 3 areas that are already rather male-dominated. So in a sense, we were just integrating all the male-dominated aspects of the music profession.
It's male-dominated cubed, right?
Yeah, and that would somehow be more inviting to women and people of color was kind of a strange concept. So then we had to rethink some things. We said, okay, so what are some of the things that we're doing wrong? And I'm not sure we still have a predominance of men in our program, and we have worked very diligently to try and diversify our faculty somewhat. Even our faculty is male dominated, right? So it's the kind of thing where you try and you think of methods to change things, but they don't always work out even as you plan. The thing that I try to convey in the article is you have to be intentional in your effort. You can't just sort of wish that it would get better and expect it to get better. You have to take real steps. So, for example, in a faculty search, it's not like you're going to say, okay, we're going to hire a woman and we're going to exclude all men. That's not even legal, not much less advisable. But you might say, what we are looking for is somebody who's different from us, who has some ideas we don't already have. And that then, by focusing on scholarly diversity or aesthetic diversity, you happen upon demographic diversity.
Right.
And I would say the same is true with admissions into a graduate program. You shouldn't just look for the person who already fits your idea of what a good computer musician is, but rather somebody who seems different, who would bring a different kind of aesthetic to your program, or who has potential not yet realized that you can see in this person. So it's not even so much a matter of setting quotas or anything like that. It's really a matter of looking to get out of your own box as an established faculty member, for example.
Well, I'm really glad you phrased it and you put it that way, because sometimes it does seem like almost a different colonialism to say, now we white men are going to deign to allow
absolutely
this to occur. And in fact, it describes it more like we need to have more voices and we need to have more perspectives, and that comes from a lot of different places, including gender and racial diversity. So that's something that's, I think, easier to imagine, but it's also then easier to imagine how you make the right play out of it, right?
Right.
It doesn't become a quota thing. Instead, it becomes a we need voices thing.
Yes, and I think we talked about how composers, and particularly computer music composers, are the rogue oddballs of their departments. And oftentimes they're the rogue liberal oddballs of their departments. In other words, they're the most liberal minds of their departments. And yet, as a group, they find themselves part of this field of academic computer music that is, in its own ways, very conservative and very elitist and very exclusionary.
Right.
And so you'd say any one of these individuals is liberal-minded, of goodwill, wants good things to happen, and yet somehow as a group we're not making it happen. And there's again where I think you have to think, it's not like I'm pointing fingers at anyone, because I could just as easily point fingers at myself and all the ways that I'm conservative and reinforce stereotypes and so on. But it's really a matter of just being aware of these things, being intentional about trying to change them, and recognizing the good that will come if we do manage to change them. And
right.
The fact that the people who have the power to change them are mostly white men in positions of establishment, that's where that sort of, okay, it's not like we're deigning to let other people join our ranks. We're saying this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and the people who have the most power to address it are those of us who are part of the problem.
Yeah, it sometimes seems just uncomfortable to talk about it because you end up have to walk down those trails, but it needs to be discussed. And I mean, this is where sort of that liberalism becomes important, because you have to be able to look beyond your own needs and desires, selfish needs and desires, to be able to affect change in the community, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting to think about the value of, I've talked about the value of diversity for social justice, the value of diversity for hybrid vigor, but just the value of diversity for diversity's sake. Meaning, wouldn't you want to have pieces of music at your SEAMUS conference that are different from the ones you always hear?
Right.
And of course, most people will say yes to that, and you know, and they may even think they themselves are doing it. But you could also say, let's be very intentional about trying to include people who might even do music that we detest. And I say we as if everybody had the same musical taste, but you know, that we on the curatorial committee, let's say. Yeah. Okay, so what does that mean? Maybe you should change your damn curatorial committee to get some people who have some different tastes on that. You know, so these are things I think that we just need to always be thinking about. How can we address them and just make our world more interesting by doing so.
That was a great. I've been wanting to talk to someone about this because it's something that I've been seeing so much recently in conferences and different things, again, both in academics and in the MI world. And so it's really great to kind of have a discussion about it. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Before you go, I'd like to ask, it's something I like to talk to, particularly people in the academic world. What do you see as the future? I like doing some future casting, and some people kind of garf at the idea of having to cast out a bit, but I think that academics oftentimes are in a good position to kind of see at least general directions. I'm curious what you think of as sort of like the future of computer music, computer technology as it relates to music, and kind of the integration of that music into the broader art world.
Yeah, I wish I were even remotely qualified to answer that.
If you're not qualified, buddy, we're all screwed.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. I'm not sure if one can guide the path toward the future, or would even want to. It's more just a sort of conjecture, isn't it, of you know, what might occur. One thing that I thought about a lot that doesn't even have much to do with technology, but maybe I can somehow find a way to drag it back to the question that you posed, is how different musical genres and cultures are increasingly being, I won't say integrated, but people are increasingly making the attempt to integrate musical cultures, or to, unfortunately, sometimes appropriate other musical cultures. But this idea of trying to implement music that incorporates Korean music or Persian music, or maybe get some Persian and Korean musicians together and see what results. You know, you have the Silk Road Ensemble, you have the Big World Orchestra. You have all kinds of ensembles that are even sort of dedicated to this pursuit. Yet it's a very complicated thing, because each musical culture, just because it's foreign to you, doesn't mean that it's not insanely sophisticated and has depth that you can't even begin to fathom. Right. And so you get an ensemble of diverse musical cultures together, and who's going to write the music for that culture, or how is that music going to be devised? Sure, you can sort of lay down a groove and everybody can do their ethnic thing, in quotes, over that, and you get a new result, certainly. But is it a musically rewarding result, and does it take us to any sort of new insights? And that's really what I'm interested in. Music is not so much as a sonic object, but as something that gives us insights into maybe other aspects of the world, or just into music itself. And so I'm really curious, just on a personal level, I'm curious about what's going to happen with this idea of different musical cultures. And I don't think that just sort of blending them or appropriating them or throwing a bunch of people together in a room, that those are really fruitful approaches. As weird and fundamentalist as this may seem, I almost feel like just valuing those cultures for what they are in a better way, and being more open to the sophistication and the interest that they already have, is more fruitful than trying to mash them together. Right. So now, does that have anything to do with music technology? I think maybe it does, in the sense that, you know, it's not like we have to join electronica and academic computer music and hip hop and sound art and all of these things into one thing. Let's just appreciate them for what they are, maybe a little better, and sort of promote the values that each one brings. I think if you're promoting people to achieve what they're trying to achieve, and that's sort of the attitude I take as a teacher. It's not like I'm trying to tell a student what to do. I'm trying to help them achieve the thing that they are trying to achieve, and maybe point out to them things that will inform that goal. And so that might be what will help us, or what will determine the future of music, is more people helping each other to achieve their goals.
Right. I tend to think of it too as being an opportunity to help them be more mindful about doing the things that they're doing, so that if they're trying to combine, you know, some Persian music and some Korean music, it doesn't represent just lapping two things on Ableton Live and pressing play.
Yes.
That there's a mindfulness involved that goes beyond just what the technologically easily burps out.
I guess what I would say is, to me, I mean, that was a very nicely crude way you put it. The technology is burping things out, but in fact, that's sort of what computers do. They're not mindful, right? They're just burping things out, and it's very easy for us to fall into that use of the computer where we're just sort of letting it do its thing. I guess that's the point I was trying to make, is that sonic object of slapping those two things together as different clips in an Ableton Live session. The sonic result of that is not really what's of interest to me so much as the ideas that that sonic result generates and embodies. It's a hard thing to express, but I think I'm more interested in the world of ideas that exist within music and that are generated by music than, you know, some sort of pursuit of some new sonic experience.
Chris, I think that sounds like a great place to be pursuing, and I'm glad to have you on the job, man. I've always kind of appreciate your thoughtfulness about the things that you do and the areas that you explore. So thanks for being out there for us, and thanks for spending the time with me. I really had a great time. I think there's still plenty of questions I wish I could ask, but our time, unfortunately, is done. So we'll have to pick this up again at some soon date.
Well, thanks for inviting me to this podcast, Darwin, and it's always a pleasure just talking to you in any circumstance, so it was really enjoyable for me.
Thanks a lot. Well, with that, I'll let you get on with your day. Have a great one.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye. Many thanks to Chris for the interview. Many thanks to you for listening. Sorry about the fuzzy sound there. I was trying out a different audio interface and I got it too close to the computer fan. Pro tip, in the future, don't do that. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the interview, and I look forward to the upcoming many interviews. We've got some really good ones on the run here, so keep tuned. Make sure you share this with everybody, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.